When we think of slavery in America, the brutality of white male slave owners often takes center stage in historical memory. But there is the disturbing, less discussed reality, one buried under silence and sanitized narratives, a truth that reveals the roles white women played, not just as passive bystanders, but as active participants in the violence, humiliation, and exploitation of black male slaves. Behind plantation walls, away from the public eye, many white women exercise their power in cruel, calculated ways that history has too often ignored or excused. From psychological torment to physical abuse, and even sexual exploitation, their actions left scars just as deep as the whips of their husbands and overseers. As we uncover the hidden truths of history, exposing the often overlooked abuse, control, and exploitation that white women inflicted upon black male slaves in the antebellum South, we would like you to kindly support our work by giving it a thumbs up. Share it with your friends and family to help spread awareness of these vital, eye-opening narratives. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another powerful episode. Now let's delve right in. Black male slave owners used sexual assault to dominate, dehumanize, and emasculate male slaves during the American antebellum era. The oppression and violence that characterized the institution of chattel slavery are easily accessible, as well as the sexual assault often inflicted on black male slaves. While many slave narratives and historical accounts highlight the sexual abuse of white women, often involving false accusations by the whites, as seen in the infamous case of Sarah Page and Dick Rowland that triggered the Tulsa Massacre, the sexual exploitation and abuse suffered by black male slaves have been largely ignored and underreported in mainstream history. While it is widely believed that only enslaved women were subjected to the violent sexual assaults of slave owners, a closer examination of the narratives of Olaudah Equiano, Harriet Jacobs, and Frederick Douglass reveals a deeper, often overlooked reality. Black male slaves also endured similar forms of abuse. These acts were not isolated cruelties, but part of a broader system designed to exploit and dehumanize an entire race in the pursuit of American wealth through forced labor. From the early years of slavery, the enslaved Africans brought to the Americas were predominantly of pure African descent. They had black skin, culture, and identity. However, as time passed, children began to appear with distinct features that reflected a blend of African and European ancestry, most times with lighter skin tones, different hair textures, facial hair patterns, and altered facial structures such as the nose and lips. A mixed race had begun to emerge. These physical traits were too evident to ignore. Upon closer observation, it became clear that these children were the result of forced sexual relations between white slave masters and black enslaved women, a brutal and widespread practice that left generations of trauma and reshaped the genetic landscape of the enslaved population. But could this be all? Definitely not. White women also began giving birth to children who bore distinctly African features, darker skin tones, broader facial structures, and textured hair, thereby raising questions that could no longer be ignored. As suspicions grew, the uncomfortable truth began to surface. These children were the result of sexual relations between white women and black male slaves. Some white women justified their actions by pointing to their husbands' affairs with enslaved black women, claiming it gave them equal license. Others said their husbands were too busy or emotionally absent, using neglect as a rationale for seeking intimacy elsewhere. Over time, these justifications multiplied, masking what was ultimately a profound abuse of power. And then again, deeper and more troubling questions arise. Despite fulfilling the sexual desires of these elite white women, were black male slaves ever truly treated with fairness or dignity? Were these encounters acts of mutual consent, or just another layer of coercion and control masked by privilege? Did such relationships offer them any relief from the relentless brutality of forced labor and punishment, or were they still subjected to the same harsh conditions at the hands of both masters and mistresses alike? The suffering endured by black male slaves was so profoundly intense that it evokes more than just pity. It forces one to pause and ask, what wrong did the black race ever commit to deserve such relentless cruelty from the white race? When we talk about white supremacy in the United States, It's often framed as a structure rooted in masculine power. In his groundbreaking book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Edward Baptist describes the planter class as embodying a hyper-masculine culture, one driven by an insatiable hunger for both economic control and sexual dominance. Yet, within this system, white planter women were not merely passive observers. While they were often shaped and constrained by this patriarchal order, many also became both participants in and beneficiaries of the same oppressive structure, wielding power in subtler yet deeply consequential ways. The planter class women were the wives and daughters of slave owners who owned and ran plantations or large farms, owned slaves, controlled contracts of indentured servants, and rented land to tenant farmers. Ultimately, the gentry had the responsibilities of patriarchs, with the lives of many relying on their decisions and planning. And their daughters' wives were expected to command enslaved people in the home and field. They were trained to have the power to issue commands, give instructions, and enforce discipline within their homes and on plantations. These women were often restricted from most of their rights. They couldn't vote, hold offices, or own properties, but there was one thing they could do. They could buy, sell, and own enslaved people. It was believed that once they married, their property technically belonged to their husbands. Therefore, there was no point for them owning properties. Instead, they were trained on how to handle the affairs of the home, including how to care for slaves. While planter-class white women in the antebellum South were confined by strict societal norms of femininity, they nonetheless wielded considerable authority within the structure of slavery. Far from being passive figures, many of these women actively exercised their power over enslaved individuals, often with cruelty and impunity. In asserting the control afforded to them by a deeply racist and patriarchal system, many of these women subjected the enslaved men under their care to severe mistreatment, psychological torment, and physical abuse. Here are some documented examples of how white women abused black male slaves. 1. Physical abuse. The physical abuse of enslaved black men by white women was a manifestation of the power dynamics of slavery, where white people held complete control over the lives of enslaved individuals. These abuses could take many forms, including whipping and flogging. White women would sometimes personally whip or flog enslaved black men for perceived disobedience or for not meeting their expectations. Also, they would beat and assault the enslaved black men. Most times they were subjected to physical assault, including punching, kicking, and being hit with different hard objects if they attempted to escape or if their work pace was low. Male slaves were not only subjected to forced labor and physical beatings as punishment for wrongdoings, but were also victims of brutal acts of branding and mutilation, often at the hands of white women. In certain cases, these women either ordered or personally carried out such acts as a means of punishment or to assert complete dominance over enslaved black men. Several documented instances reveal the extent of this cruelty. One such example is the case of Celia, whose trial brought attention to her brutal treatment of enslaved individuals. Testimonies revealed patterns of severe abuse, including branding and mutilation. Another notorious example is Mrs. Walker, the former mistress of the well-known freedman and abolitionist William Wells Brown. In his narrative, Brown describes Mrs. Walker's disturbing behavior, recounting how she whipped and mutilated enslaved men and even forced enslaved parents to whip their own children under her command. These accounts shed light on a harrowing truth that white women were not just passive participants in the system of slavery, but, in many cases, active enforcers of its cruelty. How about the famous Delphine LaLaurie? Madame LaLaurie, born as Delphine McCarty on March 19, 1787, in New Orleans, came from a family of wealth. Her family owned a sprawling 1,344-acre plantation, and her mother was known for throwing wild, extravagant parties. When Delphine was just 14 years old, she married her first husband, 35-year-old Ramon Lopez y Angulo de la Candelaria, in 1800. But the marriage was short-lived. 5 years later, while Delphine was pregnant with their child, her husband perished in a shipwreck off the coast of Cuba. When Delphine was 20 years old, she married her second husband, Jean-Paul Blanc. They ultimately had 4 children together, but this marriage, too, was short-lived. When Delphine was 28, her 50-year-old husband suddenly died. Blanc left her deeply in debt, which was only alleviated after the death of her father in 1824, as he had left his daughter a sizable inheritance. In 1826, Delphine began a romance with the younger French chiropractor, Dr. Louis Lalaurie, after one of her children had an appointment with him. At the time, Delphine was 38, Louis was in his early 20s. Shortly after she gave birth to their son, they married in 1828. However, their marriage was reportedly not a happy one. The couple was known to frequently quarrel, separate, and reconcile. Despite this, the pair purchased a handsome, unfinished home at 1140 Royal Street in New Orleans' French Quarter. They completed the Lalaurie mansion in the federal architectural style, and it appeared to be an attractive addition to the neighborhood. Few could have imagined the horrors that unfolded behind its walls. The home at 1140 Royal Street was largely occupied by Madame Lalaurie, her children, and numerous enslaved people, and before long, rumors began to spread about Madame Lalaurie's treatment of her enslaved workers. Though Madame Lalaurie acted kindly toward slaves in public and even freed some of them, some suspected that things were different behind closed doors. For one, enslaved people living at Lalaurie Mansion often seemed singularly haggard and wretched, according to locals. Indeed, whispers about Madame Lalaurie's cruel treatment reached such a pitch that a lawyer went to investigate, but he allegedly found no signs of mistreatment. But the locals had every reason to trust their instincts about Madame Lalaurie, as in many cases, her cruel treatment of enslaved people was painfully obvious. At one point, a 12-year-old enslaved girl named Leah pulled a bit too hard while brushing Madame Lalaurie's hair. Madame Lalaurie then flew into a rage. She chased the terrified girl throughout the house with a whip and up onto the roof, where Leah ran to the edge and tumbled to her death. Madame Lalaurie purportedly tried to cover this up by dumping Leah's body in a well, but there were enough witnesses that the authorities came to investigate. They found Delphine Lalaurie guilty of illegal cruelty and forced her to forfeit 9 enslaved people. However, Madame Lalaurie found a way around the punishment. She had her family members and friends purchase the enslaved people and sell them back to her. Still, much more terrible things were happening at the Lalaurie Mansion. No one knew about the depth of Madame Lalaurie's depravity until a fire broke out in the house in April 1834. On that day, after the fire broke out at the New Orleans mansion, owned by Madame Lalaurie and her husband, locals rushed in to help only discover a shocking proof of her deranged depravity. Though the elegant 2-story home at 1140 Royal Street appeared beautiful from the outside, what lay within was horrifying. For years, Madame Lalaurie had been cruelly and systematically torturing the enslaved people in her household. When the fire broke out and locals rushed in to help extinguish it, they uncovered the gruesome truth. They found one of Madame Lalaurie's cook chained to the kitchen stove, and numerous enslaved individuals in the attic, all horribly disfigured and brutally tortured. When the blaze first started on April 10, 1834, a group of locals raced to Lalaurie Mansion to help put it out. As Madame Lalaurie and her guests fled out of the house, the volunteers came across a shocking sight. In the kitchen, they found a 70-year-old emaciated cook chained to a stove. This was the first clue that something was terribly wrong at the Lalaurie's mansion. But the volunteers would soon find something much more gruesome. They eventually made their way to the attic, where the volunteers were greeted by the most appalling spectacle, according to an April 11, 1834 newspaper report from the New Orleans Bee. 7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, were seen suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. They had been confined by her for several months, and had been merely kept in existence to prolong their suffering. Perhaps most horrific, these enslaved people who were barely still alive were found among the bodies of slaves who had already been murdered. Some victims were tied to tables, others confined in tiny cages. One had her limbs broken and reset so that she resembled a crab. Some had had their mouths sewn shut, and others had their eyes gouged out. One witness even claimed that there were people with holes in their skulls and wooden spoons near them that would be used to stir their brains. Even by the brutal standards of American slavery, this was considered especially horrific. As an outraged mob assembled outside of Lalaurie Mansion, however, Madame Lalaurie was able to slip into her carriage and escape. Also, so many books, narratives, journals express more and more information about how white ladies mutilated and branded black men. Some samples of these are seen in the books Mistresses and Slaves by Marley F. Weiner. Also, White Women, Black Men, and the Politics of Sexual Exploitation by Trevor B. Lindsay. Furthermore, black male slaves were often overworked by their white mistresses. On most occasions, these women would sometimes push enslaved black men to work beyond their physical limits, leading to exhaustion, injury, illness, and even death. This wasn't all. There were several cases of starvation, either food or water. It was mostly used as a form of punishment. These women would sometimes withhold food and water from enslaved black men, leading to malnutrition and dehydration. Historians have documented these forms of physical abuse through slave narratives, diaries, and court records. For example, the book Aren't I a Woman by the historian Deborah Gray White notes that white women would often physically punish enslaved black men. Also, The Slave Narratives, an article in which former slaves recall instances of physical abuse by white women. 2. Sexual abuse. Enslaved black men were sometimes subjected to sexual abuse and exploitation by white women, which was a clear abuse of power and indeed a brutal reality. Sexual abuse is a serious violation of a person's physical and emotional boundaries involving non-consensual copulation. It's an act of power and control, often accompanied by physical force, threats, or coercion. It caused severe trauma, long-lasting emotional pain, and psychological distress to the victims. The rape of enslaved black men by white women was a heinous crime that violated their humanity. According to the words of Captain Richard J. Hinton, an abolitionist commander in the Civil War,
I have never found a bright-looking colored man whose confidences I have won, who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled, either by his mistress or by white women of the same class, to have connection with them.
There was also another account where a former slave told Hinton that his mistress ordered him to sleep with her after her husband died. These are just two out of the many examples of the many stories abolitionists like Hinton told to prove the immorality of slaveholding. According to the autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Harriet Jacobs mentions how planters' daughters would take advantage of black male slaves.
They know that the female slaves were subject to their father's authority in all things, and in some cases they exercised the same authority over the male slaves. I have myself seen the master of such a household whose head was bowed down in shame, for it was known in the neighborhood that his daughter had selected one of the meanest slaves in his plantation to be the father of his first grandchild. She did not make her advances to her equals, nor even to her father's more intelligent servants. She selected the most brutalized, over whom her authority could be exercised with less fear of exposure.
There were also several other cases of sexual harassment documented in the book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, where Harriet Jacobs told the chilling story of a male slave named Luke, who was kept chained at his bedridden mistress' bedside so that he would be constantly available to tend to his physical needs, which included sexual favors. Jacobs reported that most days Luke was only allowed to wear a shirt so that he could be easily flogged if he committed an infraction such as resisting his mistress's sexual advances. Can one really forget the trauma and pain inflicted upon these men, forced to endure the brutal invasion of their bodies? The power dynamics at play made resistance impossible, always leaving them vulnerable to the whims of their oppressors. How could such cruelty be inflicted upon human beings, treated as nothing more than property? In her detailed account of the Southern Lady, Anne Fyror Scott chronicles the skill white women exerted in buying and expanding plantations, as well as managing hundreds of enslaved black people even after the deaths of their husbands. She notes that many of these women were not only successful in acquiring land and building profitable plantations across the South, but also played active roles in overseeing their enslaved labor forces. However, beyond economic management, their power often extended into deeply disturbing abuses of authority. After purchasing enslaved individuals, some white female enslavers also subjected black men to sexual exploitation, using their unchecked dominance to violate them physically and psychologically. This dark facet of plantation life remains one of the most overlooked aspects of slavery's brutality. Sexual abuse played a dark and silent role in this trauma. While the sexual exploitation of black women by white male slaveholders has been widely documented, the coercion of black men by white women remains shrouded in silence. These acts were not just about lust, they were about control, reducing black men to objects of use and domination. Worse still, the consequences of resisting were severe: beatings, accusations of insubordination, or even lynching if rumors spread. Amidst others, here are some documented examples of enslaved black males who underwent the trauma of sexual assault. Charles Bell. Born in 1818, Charles Bell narrates his experience on how he was forced to have sex with a white woman who would visit him in the slave quarters under the guise of bringing food. She would then force him to have sex with her, threatening to punish him if he refused. John Parker. Born in 1827 and died in 1900, John Parker has his autobiography details on how he was sexually exploited by his enslaver's daughter, who would sneak into the slave quarters at night and force him to have sex with her. He also describes how enslaved men were also forced to have sex with white women as a form of punishment. Austin Stewart. Born in 1793 and died in 1860, Austin Stewart was another freed slave whose narrative describes the sexual exploitation of enslaved men, including himself, by their enslavers. He recounts how white women would visit the slave quarters and select men to have sex with, often under threat of violence. These accounts highlight the brutal reality of slavery and sexual exploitation, demonstrating how enslaved men were subjected to various forms of sexual violence and coercion. The trauma and shame associated with these experiences had long-lasting impacts on their lives and well-being as humans. 3. Psychological trauma. The psychological trauma endured by black enslaved men under the authority of elite white women in the antebellum South is a painful and often overlooked chapter of history. While many historical accounts have focused on the physical brutality of slavery, which include the use of whips, chains, forced labor, the emotional and psychological torment inflicted by white mistresses operated in more silent yet equally devastating ways. White women of the planter class, though themselves bound by gender roles in a patriarchal society, wielded immense power over the enslaved individuals in their households. Their cruelty often took on unique forms, rooted not only in control and dominance, but in manipulation, humiliation, and psychological degradation. For black men in particular, this abuse came with layers of complexity. They were expected to exhibit unwavering obedience, physical strength, and silence, all while enduring constant belittlement, threats, and unpredictable treatment from women who operated as both caretakers and tormentors. Many elite white women used their power to enforce psychological submission. A smile could be followed by a sudden slap. A gentle tone might be a setup for public humiliation. Some enslaved men were deliberately placed in impossible positions, like being forced to choose between obeying the mistress or the master, both of whom often issued conflicting commands. This constant instability eroded their sense of self and autonomy, breeding confusion, anxiety, and fear. Enslaved black men were often denied the right to express pain, grief, or despair. Their masculinity was weaponized against them, viewed as threatening, animalistic, and hypersexual, yet simultaneously denied and suppressed. When white women punished or humiliated them, it wasn't always with brute force, but with cutting words, false accusations, or by turning their children against them. The emotional wounds left by this kind of abuse often ran deeper than physical scars. Psychological trauma didn't end with emancipation. The legacy of that mental anguish passed down through generations, shaping how black men viewed themselves, their place in society, and their trust in systems of power, especially those embodied by white women in positions of authority. This overlooked aspect of slavery reminds us that trauma is not always loud. Sometimes it is inflicted with a whisper, a look, or a lie, and those wounds can be the hardest to heal. 4. Emotional manipulation. Emotional manipulation was one of the more insidious tools white women used to dominate and control enslaved black men during slavery in America. Beyond physical violence and forced labor, many white female enslavers understood how to exploit the psychological and emotional vulnerabilities of those under their power, particularly the black male slaves, often in ways that left wounds just as deep as any lash of the whip. One of the most common forms of emotional abuse was dehumanization. Enslaved black men were systematically stripped of their identity and dignity. White women would deliberately refer to them using terms like property, cargo, or chattel, reinforcing the idea that these men were less than human. By erasing their personhood, white women could justify any manner of cruelty while keeping their own conscience unbothered. Family disruption was another deeply manipulative tactic. White women who held positions of control on plantations often orchestrated the separation of enslaved families. Fathers were torn from children, husbands from wives, and siblings from one another. These acts weren't always done for profit. Sometimes they were simply expressions of unchecked power. Knowing that an enslaved man could be emotionally shattered by the loss of his family, these women used that pain as a form of psychological punishment and control. Physical violence often accompanied emotional manipulation. Many white women administered or ordered beatings, whippings, or even mutilations for minor offenses or mere defiance. But the emotional impact extended beyond the physical wounds. Such violence were meant to instill fear, break spirits, and remind the enslaved men that their bodies, emotions, and futures were entirely controlled by someone else. By weaponizing emotional pain, white women helped to maintain the brutal structure of slavery. Their cruelty didn't always appear in public records as clearly as that of their male counterparts, but it was deeply felt and remembered in the hearts of those who endured it. Emotional manipulation was quite a tool of domination, quiet, vicious, and devastating. As guardians of the home, these planter-class white women were responsible for upholding traditional Christian values and keeping peace within the domestic sphere. As such, they were valued for their homemaking abilities, maternal instinct, and perhaps above all, their virtue. As one letter to a South Carolinian periodical geared toward young women put it, "If a female possesses beauty, wealth, and in short, all the accomplishments which wealth can purchase, without virtue, she is nothing of worth. Her accomplishments may be admired by some for a little while, it is true, but she will never be truly esteemed. Permit me to ask, which would you rather have, virtue without accomplishments, or accomplishments without virtue?" Women were seen as physically and intellectually inferior to men, but much more pious, pure, and moral. This trope is expressed by Reverend William Hooper in his 1940 address to the graduating class of the Sedgwick Female Seminary in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Leave men to themselves without the intermixture of female society and the softening influence of female modesty, gentleness, and affection, and they would infallibly become rude, harsh, coarse, quarrelsome, and in their quarrels cruel and unrelenting. The world would resemble an amphitheater of wild beasts.
The honor and virtue Southerners attributed to white women, especially of the upper class, was nearly synonymous with a reputation for sexual purity, sustained by restraint, prudence, and modesty in every area of life. White women's sexuality was heavily regulated by law as well as by culture. Adultery was considered a greater offense for women than for men, and was punished more harshly. Similarly, giving birth out of wedlock was considered much more of a social problem for white women than for anyone else. White women whose affairs with slaves were made known faced varying degrees of public humiliation. When a planter's daughter or wife was discovered to be pregnant by a slave, great pains were taken to cover up the pregnancy. The resulting child might have been sold into slavery, but infanticide was not an uncommon means of avoiding scandal. The fact that affairs between planter-class women and slaves were relatively uncommon is unsurprising because white women in the South were sexually restricted as compared to their male counterparts, and 19th century contraceptive techniques were nearly effective or not accessible enough to ward off the possibility of pregnancy. Still, sexual contact between white women and black men did occur in slaveholding societies, more often than perhaps many are aware, and a lot of factors have contributed to the incidence of such relations. First, even though the sexuality of Southern white women was, as stated, heavily regulated, women were not as entirely sexually repressed as one might assume. According to historian Elizabeth Fox Genovese,
slaveholding culture emphasized control of female sexuality. It did not deny its existence.
She says that white women had a striking lack of neurotic inhibition. Like their husbands, Southern women had pre- and extramarital sex. The dangers of having sexual relations with a black man rather than a white man were enormous in terms of the possibility of producing a mixed-race child, although birth control and abortion methods were present in the 19th century, but they were not as widely used, safe, or accessible as they are today. Condoms made out of animal skin, membrane, oiled silk, and rubber were used along with other contraceptive techniques to prevent pregnancy, but they weren't all reliable. For much of the 19th century, abortion was largely unregulated, and it was not limited to poor, immigrant, or black women. Upper and middle-class white women, too, had abortions, and this would have allowed white women to have affairs with black men with some level of confidence that they would not be caught. There is also a possibility that affairs between white women and slaves were simply not noticed or recorded as often as they occurred. While it may have been expected to a certain extent that white men would transgress morally by having sexual relations with slaves, a white woman choosing to have sex with a black man might not have been considered a likely occurrence. Additionally, an upper-class woman under suspicion of an affair with a slave could readily invoke images of chastity in order to allay trouble for herself, or in other words, accuse the slave of rape, because just like black women, black men were seen as inherently lustful and prone to sexual vice. For an elite woman to have illicit sex with a black rather than a white man might have been a slightly safer bet. It was easier to blame a black man of rape than a white man. Why these women chose to sexually abuse slaves probably varied by situation. Perhaps some of them were simply bored or sexually frustrated. It is possible the sexual exploitation of slaves by women who had little power in relation to white men was a source of enjoyment that created a feeling of power. According to one historian, few scholars have viewed the relationships of enslaved men and free white women through the lens of sexual abuse in the past because of gendered assumptions about sexual power. This is in keeping with both the standard feminist conceptualization of rape as a tool of patriarchal oppression, as well as the traditional unfeminist notion of women as too weak, emotionally and physically, to commit serious crimes, let alone sexual abuse, and the idea that men cannot be raped. However, it later became clear that women, too, are capable of committing sexual offenses, and most times they use sex as a means of domination and control. Although not much, there is considerable documentation of white women coercing black men into having sex. According to Captain Richard J. Hinton, an abolitionist commander in the Civil War,
I have never found a bright-looking colored man whose confidences I have won, who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled, either by his mistress or by white women of the same class, to have connection with them.
One former slave told Hinton that his mistress ordered him to sleep with her after her husband died. These are just two examples of the many stories abolitionists like Hinton told to prove the immorality of slaveholding. In Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, 1867, Jacobs mentions how planters' daughters would take advantage of male slaves.
They know that the women slaves are subject to their father's authority in all things, and in some cases they exercise the same authority over the male slaves. I have myself seen the master of such a household whose head was bowed down in shame, for it was known in the neighborhood that his daughter had selected one of the meanest slaves on his plantation to be the father of his first grandchild. She did not make her advances to her equals, nor even to her father's more intelligent servants. She selected the most brutalized, over whom her authority could be exercised with less fear of exposure.
Even if the young white woman in this story did not consider herself a sexual assaulter, which she probably did not, this is clearly sexually predatory behavior. The kind of relationship described here, which Jacob suggests was not uncommon, cannot be classified as consensual in any meaningful sense of the word, and in fact constitutes a form of sexual abuse, if not rape. Thus, it is obvious that plantation mistresses and elite women, like their male counterparts, were able to sexually consensual in any meaningful sense of the word, and in fact constitutes a form of sexual abuse, if not rape. Thus, it is obvious that plantation mistresses and elite women, like their male counterparts, were able to sexually control and abuse their slaves. Why these women chose to sexually abuse slaves probably varied by situation. Perhaps some of them were simply bored or sexually frustrated, but perhaps, at least on a subconscious level, sexually exploiting slaves was a means of compensating for their lack of power in other aspects of their lives. Again, planter-class women were considered the property of their husbands and lacked considerable sexual agency relative to men. It is possible the sexual exploitation of slaves by women who had little power in relation to white men was a source of enjoyment that created a feeling of power. This is not to excuse the actions of sexually abusive white women, nor is it to suggest that female sexual abuse of slave men would not have occurred had women enjoyed a higher status in society. However, just as slave-owning white women often took out their frustrations on slaves through excessive cruelty and violence, they probably also used sex as a means of domination and control in a society in which they were relatively powerless. As we confront these untold horrors, we must remember that history is not just a collection of dates and names. It's a record of lived experiences, silenced voices, and generational trauma. The suffering of black male slaves in the hands of white women is a reality that has long been overlooked, often buried beneath romanticized versions of antebellum life. The issue of upper-class white female sexual abuse of enslaved black men has not received the scholarly attention it truly deserves. Aside from works like Martha Hode's White Women, Black Men, which directly explores this subject, most historical accounts either gloss over it or, like Catherine Clinton's The Plantation Mistress, dismiss it altogether. And yet, while these occurrences may have been less frequent than the widely discussed abuse of white women by black men, they were no less disturbing, complex, or exploitative, and are certainly no less deserving of deep reflection and academic inquiry, because on most occasions, they were usually false accusations. By bringing these truths to light, we are not rewriting history, but we're revealing the pages that were deliberately torn out. However, if this video segment opened your eyes a bit, or challenged all you're used to hearing concerning black slaves' abuse, don't let the conversation stop here. Hit the thumbs up button before you, share with friends and families to help amplify silent stories, and kindly subscribe to stay tuned in to the channel for more content that brings black hidden truths to light. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.